The summer air hung thick with the fragrance of blooming wildflowers and the buzzing of cicadas that droned like a lullaby over the small town. School had just ended for the day, and the children of Maplewood Elementary poured out into the sunlit yard, their laughter and shouts colliding with the rustling of leaves. Among them, Barbara Williams clutched her worn leather satchel, the strap frayed from years of use, and skipped toward the large oak tree at the far edge of the schoolyard. Its branches stretched like arms, heavy with green leaves, casting a generous circle of shade that had become a sanctuary for two particular children. Jensen Peter was already there, his shirt untucked and his knees scraped from a fall during recess. He held a small comic book he had hidden all day under his desk, and his mischievous smile widened when he saw Barbara approach. "You are late," Jensen teased, brushing the dirt from his palms. Barbara stuck out her tongue playfully, her eyes sparkling. "Mrs. Henderson kept me back to help carry the chalk box. She said I was the only one careful enough not to drop it, unlike someone I know who cannot sit still for even one lesson." Jensen laughed, a carefree sound that carried across the yard. "I did not drop it. I just borrowed it to draw a spaceship on the blackboard." Barbara rolled her eyes, but sat beside him beneath the sprawling oak. The ground was cool here, the grass soft against her legs. She tugged at the braid that had begun to loosen during the day and leaned close to peek at his comic. Bright colors of caped heroes leapt from the pages, swords flashing, monsters roaring. "You are going to get in trouble if Mrs. Henderson finds out," she whispered. "She will not," Jensen replied confidently, "because I am careful." The words had barely left his lips when a sharp voice rang across the yard. "Jensen Peter, what is that in your hands?" Mrs. Henderson, strict but fair, marched toward them with her brow furrowed. The comic slipped from Jensen's grasp, but Barbara snatched it before the teacher could see. She shoved it quickly behind her back. "It is mine, Mrs. Henderson," Barbara said in a rush, her cheeks flushed but her eyes steady. "I brought it to school by mistake." Jensen turned toward her in shock, ready to protest, but her small hand pressed against his arm, warning him to stay silent. Mrs. Henderson sighed, shaking her head. "Barbara Williams, you know the rules. No comics in class. You will stay after school tomorrow and write lines on the board, 100 times. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Barbara answered softly. When the teacher walked away, Jensen's face twisted with guilt. "Why did you do that? It was my fault." Barbara smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Because you promised me you would not get in trouble again, and promises are important." Jensen's chest tightened. He hated the thought of her bearing a punishment that should have been his. In the shade of the oak tree, with the afternoon sun dappling her face through the leaves, she looked braver than any of the heroes in his comic book. "I will never let you take the blame for me again," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of a vow. "I promise, Barbara." The sincerity in his eyes startled her, but she nodded, holding his gaze. Silence hung between them for a moment, filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of children heading home. Then Jensen scrambled to his feet, brushing grass from his shorts. He bent a stick into the dirt and began to draw clumsy shapes. "What are you doing?" Barbara asked, standing to look over his shoulder. "A promise," he said. "My dad told me once that real promises need something to keep them strong. So I am writing ours here under the oak tree. No matter what happens, we will always find each other again, even if we are apart." Barbara's heart fluttered. She knelt beside him, tracing the shaky lines he had drawn. Two stick figures stood beneath a lopsided heart, their names scrawled beneath. She added a crooked flower beside them and smiled shyly. "And what if we grow up and forge?" she asked. "Then I will remind you," Jensen said firmly. "We will get married one day, Barbara. That is what this means." Her cheeks burned with a warmth she could not explain, but she did not laugh or tease him. Instead, she pressed her small hand over his in the dirt, sealing their childish vow beneath the roots of the old oak. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Marcus, Thomas's driver, arrived in a sleek black car at the yard's edge, calling Jensen to come home. "Your family is so fancy," Barbara whispered, glancing at the car. "I bet they would not like me very much." Jensen shook his head fiercely. "I do not care what they like. You are my best friend. You are more important than any of them." He held her hand tightly, his small fingers warm and insistent. "Promise you will not forget me." "I promise," Barbara said softly, her eyes glistening. They stood beneath the golden oak, the setting sun painting the world in hues of amber and fire. It was a moment that felt endless, as though the world itself paused to etch its vow into eternity. But eternity was fragile. The next day, whispers spread that the Peter family was leaving Maplewood. Jensen's father had received an urgent business opportunity in New York. Thomas, stern and unyielding, had made the decision overnight. Jensen's protests were dismissed, his tears ignored. On the morning of their departure, the black car waited at the curb, luggage stacked neatly in the trunk. Dorothy, Jensen's elegant mother, comforted Carolyn, who cried at the thought of leaving her friends. Marcus loaded the last of the suitcases while Thomas stood beside him, his expression carved from stone. Jensen broke free from his mother's hand and ran across the street, his heart pounding. He had to see Barbara. He had to keep his promise. He found her by the oak tree, clutching a ribbon in her hand. Her eyes widened when she saw him running toward her, breathless and desperate. "They are making us leave," he cried. "I do not want to go, Barbara. I want to stay here, with you." Barbara's lips trembled, but she forced herself to be brave. "You promised me. You said we would find each other again. So even if you go, I will wait. I will not forget." She tied the ribbon to a low oak branch, the fabric fluttering in the wind. "This will be here until you come back." Jensen clung to her, his small hands gripping hers as though the strength of his will could hold back the tide of fate. "I will come back. I swear it." The honk of the car horn shattered the moment. Thomas's voice called sharply across the street, commanding Jensen to return. With tears streaming down his face, Jensen pulled away, memorizing every detail of Barbara's face, the ribbon on the tree, the smell of summer grass. He ran back to the car, each step heavier than the last. Barbara stood rooted beneath the oak, her eyes locked on the departing car. The ribbon swayed in the wind like a flag of hope and sorrow. She whispered into the air, her voice trembling yet resolute. "I will wait for you, Jensen Peter, even if it takes forever." The car disappeared down the road, leaving behind only dust and silence. Beneath the golden oak, a promise had been made, and though the world would change, though 20 years of storms and shadows lay ahead, that promise would remain etched in the soil, waiting to be fulfilled. Barbara pressed her hand against the tree's rough bark, her heart aching but steadfast. Somewhere far away, Jensen sat in the back of the car, his hand pressed against the window, whispering her name into the blur of distance. And so began a story not of chance, but of destiny, sealed by the vow of 2 children beneath the golden oak, a vow that time itself would be forced to honor. The morning sun rose slowly over Maplewood, bathing the quiet streets in a glow of innocence that belied the storm brewing inside the Peter household. Within the stately home that stood on the hill overlooking the town, suitcases lay open on the polished floor, clothes folded with the precision of Dorothy Peter's delicate hands. She moved briskly, her silk dress whispering as she bent to fasten clasps, her face tight with unease. Carolyn sat on the edge of her bed, hugging a stuffed bear, her eyes swollen from a night of tears. "Why do we have to leave Mama?" she asked tremblingly. Dorothy smoothed her daughter's hair, sighing as she searched for words. "Your father has important work in New York. It is a chance he cannot refuse." But the truth weighed heavier than Dorothy's gentle tone suggested. Thomas had not merely received an opportunity, he had been cornered. For weeks, he had hidden the telegrams and the threatening letters from rival business people, the mounting debts that nipped at the heels of his empire. He had spent sleepless nights staring at ledgers, the red ink spreading like a disease across the page. To stay in Maplewood was to watch everything collapse. To leave was to seize a lifeline, but one that demanded sacrifice. In his study downstairs, Thomas stood stiffly at the window, his silhouette rigid against the morning light. Marcus, his loyal driver, waited respectfully by the door, cap in hand. "The car is ready, sir," Marcus said quietly. Thomas gave a curt nod, but his eyes lingered on the distant oak tree that crowned the schoolyard, visible from his window. He had seen Jensen and Barbara playing there countless times, their laughter drifting faintly to the house. The sight should have softened him, but instead it hardened his resolve. Attachments were distractions. He would not let childish promises jeopardize the future of his family. Yet beneath that stern exterior lay the faint echo of a younger Thomas, a man who had once defied his own father to marry Dorothy despite having nothing. He buried the memory ruthlessly, unwilling to let it sway him now. Upstairs, Jensen stood frozen at the doorway of his room, staring at the half-packed suitcase on his bed. His heart pounded with panic. The news had broken over him like a storm the night before. Leave Maplewood, leave Barbara. The very thought was unbearable. He grabbed the suitcase and shoved it aside, as if denying its presence would change everything. Carolyn sniffled from across the hall. "Jensen, are you crying too?" He wiped his eyes fiercely. "No, I am not. I am going to see Barbara. I have to." Ignoring Dorothy's call for breakfast, he ran down the stairs, out the front door, and across the dew-soaked grass toward the oak tree. His shoes slapped the ground as though speed could hold back the inevitable. Barbara was already there, waiting as though she had known he would come. The ribbon she had tied yesterday still fluttered on the branch, a fragile banner of hope. She knew when she saw his face, pale with fear and streaked with tears. "They are really making you go," she whispered. Jensen nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He bent down, scooping up a stick, and scratched furiously at the dirt beneath the oak. His strokes were wild, desperate, carving their names deeper beside the heart they had drawn yesterday. "Maybe if I write it repeatedly, it will stay forever," he choked out. "Maybe then nothing can take it away." Barbara knelt beside him, her small hand trembling as she reached to steady his. "You do not need to. It is already here. I will remember. Even if you forget, I will remember for both of us." "I will not forget," Jensen insisted. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His dark eyes burned with a fire she had never seen before. "Listen to me. I will find you again, no matter where I am, no matter how long it takes. I swear it." Her lips quivered, but she nodded, clinging to the fierce certainty in his voice. She wanted to believe it with every fiber of her being. She had to. The sound of an engine roared in the distance. The sleek black car pulled up at the curb, Marcus stepping out to open the door. Thomas followed, his expression like granite. Dorothy stood beside him, sorrow flickering in her eyes, though she said nothing. "Jensen," Thomas called sharply, "it is time." Jensen shook his head violently. "I am not ready. I cannot leave her." "You can and you will," Thomas replied coldly. "This is not a matter of choice." Barbara's hands tightened on his. "Go," she whispered through tears. "If you stay, your father will only be angry. But remember the ribbon. Remember this place. That way, you are never really gone." He pressed his forehead to hers for a fleeting second, breathing in the scent of wildflowers tangled in her hair, the sound of her shaky breath. It was a moment he tried to capture, to seal in his memory like a photograph that could never fade. Then Thomas's voice cut through again, sharper this time. "Jensen! Now!" Reluctantly, Jensen pulled away. He walked backward at first, unwilling to break his gaze from Barbara, until Marcus's hand guided him firmly toward the car. His legs felt heavy, his chest hollow. Barbara stood beneath the oak, her figure small and fragile, but her eyes resolute. She raised her hand in a final wave, the ribbon fluttering above her like a promise carried on the wind. The car door slammed shut. Inside, Jensen pressed his face against the window, watching Barbara until she blurred. He mouthed her name, his breath fogging the glass, his fist clenched around the comic book she had once taken the blame for. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on his knee, but he shook it off, burying his face in his hands. Carolyn began to cry again beside him, frightened by the tension that hung like a storm cloud inside the car. Thomas sat rigidly in the front seat, his jaw locked, and his eyes fixed straight ahead. The road stretched long before them, carrying them away from Maplewood, away from the golden oak that had witnessed the birth of a promise. Barbara remained standing long after the car had vanished, her fingers pressed against the rough bark, her tears soaking into the soil. The ribbon danced in the wind, a fragile but unbroken tether between two hearts now worlds apart. That night, Barbara lay awake in her small bed, staring at the moonlight spilling through her window. Every sound of the night pressed down on her like a reminder of absence: the chirping crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the whisper of leaves outside. She clutched the memory of Jensen's voice, repeating it to herself like a prayer. "I will come back. I swear it." Far away in a lavish New York apartment, Jensen sat on the floor of his new room, knees pulled to his chest. His suitcase lay unopened. The city outside blazed with lights and noise, but it felt like a prison to him. He closed his eyes and saw Barbara's face, the ribbon, the oak tree bathed in the setting sun. He whispered her name into the dark, clutching the comic book like a lifeline. Thomas worked late into the night in his new office, poring over contracts and ledgers, believing he had secured the future. Yet even he could not escape the image that haunted the back of his mind: his son's tear-streaked face at the oak tree. He told himself business needed to demand sacrifices. Still, a flicker of unease gnawed at him, a whisper that perhaps he had severed more than he intended. And so the days passed, then weeks, then years. Letters never came. Phone calls never reached. Life swept them in different directions. But beneath the golden oak of Maplewood, the ribbon endured, weathered by sun and storm, yet unbroken. It was a silent witness to a vow neither time nor distance could erase. A vow etched, not in ink or stone, but in the beating of two young hearts. The shadow of fate had fallen over them, but within that shadow glimmered the fragile light of hope, waiting for the day destiny would call them back together. 20 years can pass like a whisper, reshaping faces, hardening voices, and burying childhood memories beneath the weight of duty and time. Yet the vow made under the golden oak had never truly faded for Barbara Williams and Jensen Peter. It lived quietly inside them, an ember that refused to die. Barbara had grown into a woman whose compassion was known across St. Mary's Hospital halls. Her days stretched endlessly with the rhythm of rushing footsteps, ringing monitors, and whispered reassurances to frightened patients. She had chosen nursing not for prestige, but for purpose. Life had not been generous with her, yet she gave generously to others, pouring herself into a career that often demanded more than she had to offer. Sometimes, when the night grew still and exhaustion pressed heavily on her bones, she would sit by her small apartment window and gaze at the moon. Her fingers would trace the faded ribbon tucked in a box beneath her bed, a piece of cloth once tied to an oak tree in a faraway town. In those quiet moments, she would wonder where Jensen was. Did he keep his promise? Did he even remember? She had tried to move on once. David Morrison had seemed like a steady choice, a man of good reputation and kind manners who offered her security. But standing beside him, Barbara had felt an emptiness she could not name. When the engagement ended, she told herself it was for the best. The whispers of failure and questions from friends haunted her. The truth was more straightforward. Her heart had never belonged to anyone but Jensen. Meanwhile, Jensen Peter had ascended into a world of towering glass buildings, billion-dollar contracts, and power that bent others to his will. The boy who once scribbled stick figures beneath an oak tree was now a man whose name filled financial newspapers. He had everything the world promised: wealth, influence, and a reputation as a business titan. Yet, he lived in silence once the meetings ended and the lights of his penthouse dimmed. He had never stopped searching for Barbara. Over the years, he had sent discreet inquiries, hired investigators, and even returned to Maplewood under the cover of anonymity. Each attempt ended with disappointment. Records lost, addresses outdated, rumors leading to dead ends. It was as if she had vanished, leaving only the memory of her smile and the feel of her small hand pressed against his. Thomas remained a looming shadow in Jensen's life. Even after 2 decades, his father's expectations still pressed on him like iron chains. The arranged marriage with Miranda Patterson had been dangled before him as both a business necessity and a test of loyalty. Jensen played along only to a point, offering polite deferrals and evasions, but he knew the confrontation would come one day. He told himself he was buying time. Deep down, he knew he was still waiting for her. Fate wove its threads with ruthless precision on a rain-slicked evening in New York. Jensen had been returning from a late meeting, exhaustion tightening his shoulders. His driver had called in sick, so he drove himself through the congested streets, eager for solitude. The rain fell in heavy sheets, distorting the world into smears of color and light. A delivery truck skidded on the slick pavement at an intersection near the hospital. Jensen swerved sharply, but the collision came with a shattering of glass and the groan of metal twisting. When his vision cleared, he was on a stretcher, fluorescent lights flashing above him as voices barked instructions. His chest ached. Blood trickled from his temple, and for the first time in years, fear clawed at him. "Get him to trauma now," a voice commanded with calm authority. Through the haze, Jensen tried to focus. The voice was familiar in a way that made his pulse quicken, though his mind refused to believe it. As the gurney rolled into the emergency bay, a figure leaned over him, her face framed by strands of dark hair escaping from a surgical cap. Her eyes, steady yet filled with compassion, locked with his. Barbara. The world tilted. The pain in his chest seemed to fade beneath the shock of recognition. 20 years collapsed into a single instant. Barbara froze for a heartbeat, her professional composure struggling against the flood of memories. She had learned to steady her hands no matter the chaos, but now they trembled as she checked his vitals. She forced herself to focus, to push through the storm inside her. "Head laceration, possible rib fracture," she reported to Dr. Martinez, who had stepped in beside her. "Prep him for scans," Dr. Martinez ordered, barely glancing at her expression. Jensen reached for her wrist with surprising strength, his voice hoarse. "Barbara, is it really you?" Her throat tightened, but she shook her head quickly. "Save your strength, sir. We will take care of you." She could not falter now, not with her colleagues watching. But the sound of his voice, the way he spoke her name as though no time had passed, ripped through her carefully built walls. The scans confirmed broken ribs but no life-threatening injuries. Hours later, when the chaos had ebbed and Jensen rested in a quiet recovery room, Barbara lingered at the doorway. She should not have gone in. Professional boundaries screamed against it. Yet she stepped forward, drawn by the same force that had pulled her to the oak tree all those years ago. He stirred at the sound of her footsteps. His eyes opened, still groggy, but clear enough to focus on her. "I knew I would find you," he whispered. Barbara's breath caught. She wanted to tell him she had waited, that every day without him had been a hollow echo, but fear held her tongue. Could they really bridge 20 years with a few stolen words? "I never stopped looking," Jensen continued, his voice gathering strength. "Not once. With every deal I signed, and every city I traveled to, I searched for you. And here you are, standing before me like no time has passed." Tears welled in her eyes, despite her efforts to hold them back. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his just as it had beneath the oak tree. "You remembered," she said softly. "I could never forget." Silence filled the room, heavy yet electric. The years apart had carved lines on their faces, but they were children again in this moment, standing beneath branches heavy with summer leaves. Barbara pulled away suddenly, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. "You need rest. This changes nothing. You are a patient. I am a nurse. That is all." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The ember that had smoldered for 20 years now flared into flame, and no rule or boundary could extinguish it. Later, when her shift ended and the corridors grew quiet, Barbara walked home in the rain. Her heart raced with fear and longing. What if his world was too far removed from hers? What if the distance between a billionaire and a nurse was greater than 20 years of separation? Yet the memory of his voice, firm with conviction, whispered against her doubts. "I knew I would find you." And so the fateful night ended, not with closure, but with a door flung wide to destiny. Fate had circled back, weaving together two lives that had once been torn apart. Under the shadow of skyscrapers and hospital lights, The promise made beneath the golden oak stirred once more, demanding to be fulfilled. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city washed clean, its streets gleaming beneath the early sunlight. Yet, for Barbara Williams, the world felt far from clear. She stood in her small kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee she had not touched. The steam curled upward and vanished, much like her ability to reason. Sleep had eluded her after the night's events. She had spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the recovery room when Jensen Peter had looked at her with eyes that knew her instantly. Eyes that had carried a promise across 20 years of silence. Barbara had thought herself prepared for anything, and years of nursing had taught her to face death, grief, and desperation with unshaken calm. But she had not been prepared for Jensen. She had not been prepared for the sudden collapse of 2 decades into a single gaze. For her heart had quickened at the sound of his voice saying her name. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on it. He was her patient. He was a billionaire with a world entirely separate from hers. She was a nurse who lived in a modest apartment with peeling paint on the walls and bills stacked on the table. Yet none of those thoughts stopped her chest from tightening with the memory of his hand brushing hers. At the hospital, she forced herself into composure. Jensen's injuries had been stabilized, and his private room now resembled a luxury suite more than a ward. Flowers lined the windowsill, delivered by business associates and admirers. Rebecca, his sharp and efficient assistant, was already on the phone outside, her clipped voice arranging meetings. Jensen insisted that the meeting could not be postponed, despite his condition. When Barbara entered, Jensen's gaze found her instantly, ignoring the bustling activity around him. His face was pale, but his smile carried the same boyish stubbornness she remembered from Maplewood. "You came," he said softly, as though he had been holding his breath. "I am your nurse," she replied briskly, checking his vitals. "Of course I came." But her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the monitor, betraying her calm facade. Rebecca stepped in frowning. "Mr. Peter, your schedule is already delayed. You should not be exhausting yourself with unnecessary conversations." "Rebecca," Jensen interrupted firmly, his eyes still on Barbara. "Give us a moment." Barbara stiffened. "That is not appropriate. I am on duty." But Rebecca, though reluctant, understood the tone in her employer's voice. She left with a sharp glance at Barbara, which carried suspicion and curiosity. When they were alone, Jensen leaned back against the pillows, his breath catching slightly with the effort. 20 years, Barbara. I thought I would go mad searching, and here you are, standing before me as though no time has passed." Her throat tightened. "You should rest. Talking like this will only slow your recovery. Do not run from this," he pleaded. "I need to know. Did you wait for me?" The question pierced through her defenses. She had waited, though she had never admitted it aloud. She had waited through David Morrison's courtship, long nights at the hospital, and birthdays spent alone, with only the memory of a boy beneath an oak tree. Her lips parted, but the words caught. I tried to move on, I thought I had. But nothing ever felt right. Not with David, not with anyone." A flicker of relief softened Jensen's features. "Then it was not only me. Barbara, I never stopped loving you. Not for one day. I told myself that no matter how far my father dragged me, no matter how many walls he built around me, I would find you. And I have." Tears welled in her eyes, but she turned away, afraid of what surrendering to them would mean. "Jensen, you are a billionaire. You live in a world I cannot imagine. I am just a nurse with no wealth, no power. What future could we possibly have?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm despite his weakened state. "I do not want wealth without you. I do not want power if it means being alone. You are my future, Barbara. You always have been." Her heart raced, torn between longing and fear. She wanted to believe him and step back into the promise of that summer beneath the oak. But doubt gnawed at her. Could love alone bridge 20 years and the chasm of class that separated them? Before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Martinez entered, brisk and professional. "Mr. Peter, you need rest. Miss Williams, please continue with your rounds." His eyes flicked between them, noticing the tension, but he said nothing more. Barbara nodded quickly and left, her pulse pounding. As she walked down the corridor, she pressed her back against the cool wall, closing her eyes. She had seen countless patients and families fall apart under pressure. Could she risk her heart on a love that seemed doomed from the start? That evening, after her shift ended, Barbara returned to her apartment. She sat on her bed, pulling out the small box she had guarded all these years. Inside lay the faded ribbon from the oak tree, still carrying the faint scent of summer grass. She traced it with her fingers, memories flooding back. Jensen's boyish face, his voice vowing he would return, the look in his eyes when he promised her forever. Her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but curiosity made her glance at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "Do not let fear steal this from us again. Meet me tomorrow, Jay." Barbara's heart thudded. She should not. She knew the risks, yet she also knew she could not ignore the call of destiny. The next evening, she found herself standing outside a quiet cafe, the ribbon tucked in her pocket, as though it could shield her. Inside, Jensen sat waiting, dressed simply but with the same air of quiet command that had made him one of the most powerful men in the city. When she entered, his face lit up with a smile that was not the polished charm he wore in boardrooms, but the unguarded joy of the boy she once knew. "You came," he said again, his voice trembling with relief. She sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should not be here. This is reckless." "Reckless is waiting 20 years and letting fear keep us apart," he countered. "Barbara, we were children when we made that promise, but it was real. It shaped me. It gave me hope when I had nothing else. And I know it shaped you too." Her eyes filled with tears. "You do not understand what my life has been. I had to work for everything. I had to scrape by while you lived in a world of privilege. Do you really think we can erase all of that?" He reached across the table, covering her trembling hands with his. "I do not want to erase it. I want to honor it. I want to build something with you, not despite our differences, but because of them. You ground me, Barbara. You remind me of who I was before the wealth and the power. You are the part of me that has been missing all these years." She searched his face, finding no trace of doubt, only conviction, raw and unshaken. Slowly, she drew the ribbon from her pocket and laid it on the table between them. His eyes widened, emotion flashing across his features. "You kept it," he whispered. "I kept it," she admitted, "because some part of me always believed you would come back." The silence that followed was thick with 20 years of longing and unspoken words. Then, unable to resist any longer, Barbara leaned forward and Jensen met her halfway. Their lips touched in a kiss that carried the weight of time, the ache of separation, and the promise of an unwritten future. The cafe around them faded into irrelevance. For that moment, there was only the boy and the girl beneath the oak, now grown, now scarred, but still bound by a vow that time itself could not break. When they finally pulled apart, Jensen's forehead rested against hers, his voice steady with determination. "There is something I need to tell you. My father has arranged a marriage with Miranda Patterson. It is supposed to secure a business alliance, but Barbara, my heart has never belonged to her. It has always been yours, and I will not let anyone take that from me again." Fear flickered in her eyes, but hope burned brighter. She knew the battles ahead would be fierce. Thomas would not yield easily. Miranda would not stand idly by. Yet Barbara felt the ember in her chest blaze into flame for the first time in years. Whatever storms awaited them, they would face them together. And this time, she would not let go. The Peter Mansion loomed at the city's edge, a sprawling estate of marble columns and perfectly trimmed hedges, its facade as imposing as the man who ruled it. For most of New York's elite, it symbolized power and permanence, a fortress where deals were struck and alliances sealed. For Barbara Williams, however, it felt like walking into the lion's den. The evening air was heavy with anticipation as Jensen guided her through the iron gates. She had dressed with care, choosing a simple navy dress that was elegant but modest, reflecting who she was rather than who others wanted her to be. Her palms were damp, her heart quickening with every step closer to the front doors. She knew she did not belong here, among glittering chandeliers and priceless art. But she also knew she could not hide forever. If her love with Jensen was to endure, it had to survive the scrutiny of his family. "Breathe," Jensen murmured beside her, his hand warm against hers. "Whatever happens tonight, remember this. I choose you." His words steadied her, though not enough to calm the storm raging in her chest. The doors opened, and they were greeted by Dorothy Peter, whose elegance was tempered by worry in her eyes. She embraced her son warmly before turning her gaze to Barbara. Her smile was polite, though tinged with unease, as though she was torn between kindness and the weight of her husband's authority. "Welcome, Barbara," Dorothy said softly. "Please, come in." The grand hall stretched before them, its marble floors gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers. Portraits of generations of Peters stared down from the walls, silent judges of the present. At the far end of the room stood Thomas, his broad frame stiff, his expression as cold as the granite of the columns around him. He did not move to greet them, he merely observed, his sharp eyes sweeping over Barbara with calculated disdain. "You brought her," Thomas said, his voice low and deliberate. "I did," Jensen replied firmly. "Barbara is the woman I love, and I intend to marry her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Barbara felt Dorothy stiffen beside her. Carolyn, Jensen's younger sister, stood nervously by the staircase, her eyes darting between her father and brother. Before Thomas could respond, a figure stepped forward from the adjoining room. Elegant in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver, Miranda Patterson smiled with practiced charm. Her family name was whispered with reverence in every boardroom, and tonight she carried herself like a queen surveying her court. "Jensen," she said sweetly, "you should have told me you were bringing company. We could have arranged something more fitting than this casual introduction." Barbara's stomach tightened. Miranda's tone was smooth, but the flicker in her eyes revealed contempt. "This is Barbara Williams," Jensen said, his voice steady. "She is not company. She is the woman I will spend my life with." Miranda's smile tightened, though she did not falter. "How touching. A nurse, is it not? I suppose it is charming to see that fairy tales still exist. The billionaire and the commoner. One wonders how long such a story can last once the magic wears off." Barbara's face flushed, but she lifted her chin, refusing to shrink. "I am proud of what I do. I help people when they are at their weakest. That may not be glamorous, but it matters." Miranda's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Of course it does. Until you realize love does not pay the bills and compassion does not keep a company afloat." "That is enough," Jensen snapped, his voice sharp with warning. Thomas finally stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Miranda is right, Jensen. Your duty is not to childish notions of love, but to the legacy of this family. The merger with the Patterson Group is critical. It will secure not only our future, but the future of every employee who depends on us. Do you think they will thank you for throwing it all away for a fleeting infatuation?" "This is not fleeting," Jensen retorted, his fists clenched. "I have loved Barbara since we were children. 20 years apart did not change that. If anything, it made it stronger. I will not sacrifice her for a business deal." Dorothy placed a trembling hand on Thomas's arm, her voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, perhaps we should—" But Thomas silenced her with a glare. "No, I will not stand by while my son destroys everything I have built. If he insists on this madness, he will do so without my blessing and support." Barbara's heart ached at the venom in his words, but she would not let Jensen fight this battle alone. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Peter, I know you think I am not worthy of your son. Perhaps in your world worth is measured by wealth and alliances. But in mine, it is measured by loyalty, kindness, and the courage to stand by someone even when it costs you everything. If that makes me unworthy in your eyes, so be it. But I will not apologize for loving Jensen." The room fell into stunned silence. Carolyn's eyes widened, admiration flickering across her features. Even Dorothy seemed moved, though fear kept her quiet. Thomas's expression darkened. "You have spirit, I will give you that. But spirit will not save my son from ruin. If he chooses you, he chooses a life cut off from this family and everything it provides. No inheritance, no protection, no second chances. Jensen took Barbara's hand, his grip unyielding. Then so be it. I do not need your wealth, father. I do not need your empire. I only need her. Miranda's lips curled into a smile that was more venom than charm. Be careful what you wish for, Jensen. Walking away from everything is not as romantic as you make it sound. One day, she may resent you for it. And when that day comes, do not say you were not warned. Barbara felt Jensen squeeze her hand tighter, anchoring her against the storm. I would rather face hardship with her, Jensen declared, his voice echoing through the hall, than live in gilded cages built on lies. Thomas's jaw tightened. His silence was more terrifying than his words. Finally, he turned sharply on his heel and strode from the room, leaving only the echo of his footsteps behind. Dorothy followed quickly, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her love for her son. Miranda lingered momentarily, her gaze lingering on Barbara like a blade. You may think you have won tonight, she murmured, but you have no idea what awaits you outside these walls. The world is cruel to dreamers. With that, she swept from the room, her heels clicking against the marble like a clock ticking. The grand hall grew silent once more. Carolyn descended the staircase, her eyes glistening. She rushed to her brother's side, embracing him tightly. I am proud of you, she whispered. Whatever happens, you will always have me. Barbara exhaled shakily, her body trembling now that the confrontation had passed. She glanced at Jensen, whose eyes burned with determination, even as the weight of what he had done settled upon him. You meant it, she whispered. I meant every word, he replied. I will not let anyone, not even my father, take you away from me again. As they left the mansion together, Barbara glanced back one last time. The towering walls and glittering chandeliers seemed colder now, stripped of their grandeur. She knew they were stepping into an uncertain future, filled with struggle and sacrifice. But she also knew that love had survived 20 years of silence and was strong enough to withstand the storm. And so, hand in hand, they walked into the night, ready to face whatever trials awaited them. For the first time, Barbara felt not fear, but hope. The battle was only beginning, but they would fight it together. The night air outside the mansion was heavy and still, as though even the city held its breath after the storm of words that had erupted inside. Jensen led Barbara down the marble steps, his grip on her hand unyielding, his stride purposeful, despite the uncertainty that loomed before them. For a brief moment they paused at the gates, the ornate ironwork casting long shadows across the pavement. Barbara glanced back, the mansion glowing behind them like a fortress lit from within, but its golden lights no longer offered warmth. They glared like watchful eyes, warning her that she and Jensen had just declared war against the will of Thomas Peter. Her voice was soft when she spoke, edged with unease. Jensen, he meant every word. If you walk away from him, company, and everything, there will be no turning back. Jensen turned to her, his expression steady, though his eyes betrayed the moment's gravity. Barbara, I have spent too long being molded into my father's vision of who I should be. He believes love is weakness and that loyalty is measured only in profit. But I will not live a life dictated by business contracts and arranged mergers. If losing his fortune is the price of being with you, I will gladly pay it. She wanted to believe him and let the fire of his conviction banish the doubts creeping into her mind. Yet practicality gnawed at her heart. Love could not pay rent. Devotion could not keep food on the table. She had lived her life struggling to make ends meet. Could Jensen, raised in luxury, truly bear such burdens? The following morning, the consequences of their defiance arrived swiftly. Jensen's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from board members, legal advisors, and business associates. Each conversation was curt and cold. Thomas had already acted, freezing Jensen's access to company accounts, stripping him of his positions, and circulating word that no reputable firm was to employ him. It was exiled, dressed in business attire, with punishment wrapped in legality. When Barbara returned from her hospital shift that evening, she found Jensen sitting at her small kitchen table, his suit jacket draped carelessly over the chair, his tie loosened. His shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before, as though the weight of the empire he had renounced had finally pressed down upon him. They moved faster than I expected, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. Every door has been shut. No one will hire me, not as long as my father controls the industry. He has made sure of it. Barbara set down her bag, her chest tightening as she crossed to him. I told you this would happen. He is not a man who makes idle threats. Jensen lifted his head, his eyes burning with determination despite his weariness. I know, and I do not regret my choice. Not for a second. But I will admit something, Barbara. I am terrified. For the first time in my life, I do not know how to stand alone. The wealth and the privileges were cages, but they were also safety nets. Without them, I must learn to fight for survival in a world I have only ever observed from behind glass. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Then we will fight together. I have lived without safety nets my whole life. You will learn, we will learn. But you must promise me, Jensen, that you will not let them turn into resentment when the hardships come. Love can survive poverty, but only if it is strong enough to bear the weight of reality. He squeezed her hand firmly. I promise. If I falter, remind me of this moment. Remind me why I chose you, why I walked away, because you are worth more than all of it combined. The next few weeks became a trial by fire. Jensen searched for work with the persistence of a man who refused to surrender. Yet everywhere he went, doors closed. A recruiter who once courted his favor, Sandra Chen, offered polite excuses before admitting in hushed tones that her firm could not risk crossing Thomas Peter. Richard Hartwell, a construction magnate Jensen had once negotiated with, shook his head regretfully. Your father's shadow is long, Jensen. No one dares defy him. Desperation drove Jensen to odd jobs. He hauled crates in warehouses, labored on construction sites, and even took a temporary position delivering packages. His once pristine hands grew blistered. His body ached from exertion. He returned to Barbara's apartment with sweat-soaked clothes and a weariness that weighed on his spirit more than once. Barbara watched him quietly each night, her heart torn between pride and sorrow. She admired his refusal to bend, his determination to prove that love and resilience mattered more than inherited power. Yet she also saw the pain in his eyes, the humiliation of being dismissed by men who once courted his approval, the struggle of reconciling who he had been with who he was becoming. One evening, as Barbara prepared a simple meal of soup and bread, Jensen sat at the table staring at his calloused hands. His voice was low, almost broken. Do you ever regret this, Barbara? Choosing me, choosing this life of hardship when you could have chosen security with someone like David Morrison? Barbara set down the spoon, crossing the room to kneel beside him. She took his rough hands in hers and kissed them gently. I never regret choosing you. I regret only that you doubt yourself. Wealth or titles, Jensen does not define you. You are defined by the choices you make, by the love you give, and that love is worth every struggle. His eyes glistened as he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the only anchor keeping him from drifting into despair. But their trials were not only material. Outside forces stirred against them. Slighted and humiliated, Miranda Patterson began whispering into the ears of society's elite. Rumors spread quickly. Barbara was painted as an opportunist who had ensnared Jensen, a nurse hungry for wealth and status. Invitations to events dried up. Former allies avoided them. Barbara bore the whispers with quiet dignity. Though they cut deep, Jensen seethed, but she reminded him that anger would only feed their enemies. Still, she felt the weight of judgment every time she walked into the hospital, every time a colleague gave her a lingering look, wondering if the rumors were true. One night, as they sat together in the dim light of her apartment, Jensen placed a small velvet box on the table. Barbara stared at it, her breath catching. Jensen, she whispered. He opened it, revealing a simple ring, not adorned with diamonds or gold, but a modest band he had bought with the wages of his labor. It is not what I once could have given you, he said softly, but it is honest. It is mine, and it carries a promise I will never break. Tears spilled down Barbara's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, his heart steady. From this moment forward, Barbara, we build our own life, on our own terms. Whatever destiny my father planned for me, I reject it. This is my choice. You are my choice. Barbara and Jensen sealed their future in that small apartment with nothing but love to bind them. It was not gilded with wealth or protected by power. It was fragile, uncertain, and uncharted. But it was theirs, and as they embraced, Barbara realized that though they had walked away from fortune and security, they had chosen something greater. They had chosen love against destiny. And that choice, however costly, was the one that made them truly free. The first weeks after their engagement were filled with a fragile sweetness, a sense of defiance that made Barbara and Jensen feel as though they were invincible. But reality was not a storybook, and soon it pressed down on them with merciless weight. The small apartment Barbara called home became their shared sanctuary and prison. 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen were suddenly expected to contain their love, hopes, fears, and exhaustion. Jensen rose at dawn each day, leaving behind the crisp suits of his past life for heavy boots and worn jeans. He worked where he could, often in jobs that barely recognized his worth. The former billionaire now hauled crates at a warehouse near the docks, his muscles straining under the weight of boxes marked with labels he once saw from the comfort of a boardroom table. The foreman barked orders without recognizing who Jensen was, or perhaps choosing to pretend he did not. The pay was meager and the hours long. When he returned home, sweat soaking his shirt, his hands blistered and raw, Barbara would take them gently into hers, tending to the wounds with quiet patience. Yet she saw more than the bruises. She saw the shadows in his eyes, the silent battle between pride and despair. Meanwhile, Barbara carried her own burdens. Her shifts at St. Mary's grew longer as she volunteered for overtime to help cover the growing bills. The whispers among her colleagues grew louder too. Nurses exchanged glances when she walked by, their hushed tones dripping with judgment. She caught fragments of their words: opportunist, gold digger, reckless. Miranda Patterson's influence had stretched even into the sterile halls of the hospital, poisoning the air with rumors. Barbara endured silently, her smile never faltering before patients, though her heart ached with each cutting remark. She reminded herself that her love was real and her choice was hers. Yet in the quiet moments, when she sat in the break room alone, doubt crept in like a thief. One evening, as rain lashed against their apartment window, Jensen returned home later than usual. His shoulders sagged, his steps heavy, and his face carried the raw edge of humiliation. He dropped a small envelope on the table, its contents thin. "That is all for a week's work," he muttered. "Less than what my father spends on dinner." Barbara touched his arm, but he pulled away, pacing the room. "Do you know what it is like to be laughed at by men who used to beg for your approval, to be treated as though you are nothing more than a pair of hands?" Her voice was calm but firm. "I know what it is like to work hard and be overlooked. I have lived that all my life. You are not alone, Jensen." His eyes softened, the storm within him faltering. He sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "I just wanted to give you the world, Barbara. And now I cannot even give you comfort." "You give me love," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "And that is more than the world." He looked at her then, truly looked, and some of the despair melted from his face. Still the shadows lingered. The weeks turned to months, and the trials did not ease. Their savings dwindled, their meals grew simpler, and the apartment walls seemed to close in tighter. Yet, through it all, their bond did not shatter. They found joy in small things: the warmth of coffee shared before sunrise, laughter over a burned dinner, the quiet peace of falling asleep in each other's arms despite the noise of the city outside. But the past was not content to stay buried. One afternoon, as Barbara finished her shift, she entered the hospital courtyard and froze. Standing near the gate, holding an umbrella against the drizzle, was David Morrison. His presence stirred a rush of memories: the steady gaze, the kind promises, the ring she had once worn before returning it. David had aged well, his features sharpened by success. His company had flourished, and his name carried weight in the circles Jensen had once dominated. "Barbara," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something she could not name. "It has been too long." She hesitated, then nodded. "David, what are you doing here?" "I heard what happened," he replied. "About Jensen, about you." His eyes searched hers, earnest and concerned. "I wanted to see for myself if you were truly all right." "You do not deserve this kind of struggle, Barbara. You deserve stability, happiness." Her chest tightened. "I chose this life. I chose him." David's expression darkened with frustration. "And what happens when his pride drags you both into ruin? What happens when the man who once lived in luxury cannot bear the taste of poverty?" She bristled, her voice sharpening. "You do not know him as I do. He is stronger than you think." David sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I still care about you. That has never changed. If you ever need help, if you ever decide you want more than this, you know where to find me." He left her with those words, his figure fading into the misty rain. But the unease he stirred remained. When Barbara returned home, she found Jensen sitting at the table staring at a stack of rejection letters. She hesitated before telling him about David, fearing the wound it might open. But honesty had always been their anchor. Jensen's jaw tightened when she spoke, his eyes flashing with jealousy and pain. "Of course he came. He sees weakness and swoops in like a vulture." "He only offered help," Barbara said gently. "But I told him my choice was you." The anger in Jensen's eyes softened, replaced by guilt. "I am sorry, Barbara. I should not doubt you, but sometimes I fear that I will not be enough." She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You are enough. You have always been enough. We will face the shadows together." Still, the shadows pressed in. Miranda's whispers grew louder. David loomed at the edges of their lives, and Thomas's influence continued to choke every opportunity Jensen sought. Yet, in their small apartment, love remained their refuge, flickering like a candle in a storm. One night, as they sat on the floor with a single candle burning between them after the power had been cut for late payment, Jensen took Barbara's hand. His voice was quiet but fierce. "They can strip me of my wealth, titles, and pride, but they cannot strip me of you, and as long as I have you, I will fight until my last breath." Barbara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then we will fight together. And when the dawn comes, no matter how dark the night, we will still be standing." In that fragile glow, surrounded by shadows of the past and trials of the present, their love burned brighter than ever. And though the world outside plotted against them, within that small apartment, they carried a strength no wealth or power could ever buy. The Peter mansion was silent in the late-night hours, its grandeur cloaked in shadows. Thomas Peter sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the polished mahogany desk. Papers lay scattered before him, as well as contracts and financial reports that once commanded his full attention, but now blurred together into meaningless ink. The empire he had built stood firm, yet for the first time in his life, Thomas felt its foundations tremble, not from external threats, but from the fracture within his family. Jensen's defiance gnawed at him. His son's words in the grand hall echoed relentlessly in his mind. "I do not need your wealth, Father. I do not need your empire. I only need her." Thomas clenched his fists, the veins in his hands standing out against skin weathered by years of hard work and ruthless decisions. How could his son throw everything away for a nurse, a woman with nothing to offer but sentiment? He told himself it was weakness, foolishness, a betrayal of everything he had taught Jensen about power and responsibility. Yet beneath his anger lurked a sliver of something he dared not name, doubt. He rose from the desk and moved to the window, staring at the darkened city skyline. The glittering towers were a testament to his life's work, each one a battle won, a rival defeated. But the reflection staring back at him in the glass was not the unyielding titan he had built himself to be. It was a man haunted by ghosts. Unbidden, memories surged forward. He saw himself as a young man, standing in the rain outside his father's estate, Dorothy's hand in his. He had defied his father to marry her, rejecting the wealthy heiress chosen for him. He had sworn then that love was worth more than business alliances, that he would carve his own destiny. And now, decades later, he had become the very man he once despised, unyielding, controlling, willing to crush his son's happiness for profit. The irony tasted bitter on his tongue. The next morning, Thomas rode in the back of his sleek car through the city streets, Marcus at the wheel. They stopped at a traffic light near the docks, and Thomas's gaze was drawn to a figure among the crowd of workers unloading crates from a truck. Sweat darkened the man's shirt, his movements heavy but determined. For a moment, Thomas did not recognize him. Then his breath caught. Jensen. His son's once immaculate hands were blistered and bruised, his face marked by exhaustion. Laughter rang out from nearby workers, mocking the former billionaire who now bent his back like any other laborer. Thomas's chest tightened as he watched, shame and grief battling with pride. Marcus glanced in the mirror, noting his employer's expression. "Sir, should I stop?" Thomas's jaw hardened. "No, drive on." But as the car pulled away, the image burned into Thomas's mind. He could not escape it. He saw not only his son's suffering, but also the reflection of his younger self, the man who had once carried crates to earn enough for a life with Dorothy. He remembered the sneers, the mockery, the humiliation, and he remembered how love had been his only anchor. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay beside Dorothy, her breathing soft and steady, but his mind wrestled with torment. When he finally drifted into uneasy slumber, dreams claimed him. He was young again, standing in a field beneath a gray sky. His father's voice thundered, condemning his choice of love over duty. He turned to Dorothy, her eyes filled with the same fire Barbara's had carried when she defended Jensen in the mansion. Then the dream shifted, and it was Jensen standing before him, broken and weary, Barbara at his side, her defiant and compassionate gaze. Thomas awoke with a start, sweat dampening his brow, his heart pounding. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. He had become his father's echo, and in doing so, he had driven his son down the same path of defiance. But unlike Thomas, Jensen had no fortune waiting for him at the end of his rebellion. He had only Barbara and the fragile hope that love could sustain them. Over breakfast, Dorothy oversaw him. Her husband's silence spoke louder than any argument. Finally, she placed her hand over his. "Thomas, you cannot keep punishing him. You saw him yesterday, did you not?" Thomas's eyes flickered, betraying the truth. "He is suffering," Dorothy continued softly, "and so are you. This is not a strength, this is cruelty. You once fought for me against your own father's will. Why can you not see that Jensen is fighting the same battle now?" Thomas's throat tightened, but he did not respond. Carolyn, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. Her voice trembled, but was steady enough to pierce his defenses. "Father, I love my brother. I love Barbara too. They make each other strong. Please do not destroy that. Do not destroy him." Her words struck him harder than any boardroom challenge ever had. Later that day, Thomas wandered through the mansion alone, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had always felt solid but now seemed cold and empty. He paused at the family portraits lining the hallway, eyes lingering on the image of himself as a young man beside Dorothy, their smiles radiant with love untainted by the weight of responsibility. What had happened to that man? When had he allowed ambition to consume him so thoroughly that he had forgotten the very foundation upon which his life had been built? The empire no longer felt like a triumph, it felt like a cage. Driven by restlessness, Thomas ordered Marcus to take him through the city again. This time, he insisted on walking alone through the crowded streets, his polished shoes out of place among laborers and vendors. He passed a market stall where a vendor shouted insults at a man for not paying quickly enough. When the man turned, Thomas's heart clenched. It was Jensen again, this time selling trinkets to earn what little he could. The sneers of strangers stung Thomas's ears. His son's dignity was being chipped away piece by piece, and Thomas realized with horror that it was his own hand guiding the chisel. He had orchestrated this exile, and now he was forced to watch his son crumble beneath it. That night, Thomas sat once more in his study, the whiskey untouched before him. Dorothy entered quietly, her presence a balm to his turmoil. She laid a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, it is not too late. You can still choose differently." His voice broke, low and raw. "I wanted to protect him, to prepare him for this world, but all I have done is break him." Dorothy knelt beside him, her eyes filled with tears. "Then mend him. Do not let pride steal our family. Do not let your father's ghost dictate your choices any longer." Thomas buried his face in his hands, self to weep for the first time in decades. For the first time in decades. In the days that followed, he carried the weight of his guilt like a stone in his chest. Everywhere he looked, he saw reflections of his son, of his younger self, of man he once vowed never to become. The empire he had built suddenly seemed hollow, a monument erected at the cost of love. And so Thomas stood at the edge of a choice that terrified him. To admit his fault would be to shatter the identity he had clung to for so long. Yet to remain silent would mean losing his son forever. As dawn broke over the city, Thomas knew what to do. The time had come not for commands or ultimatums, but for humility. For once in his life he would not speak as a businessman or a patriarch, but as a father haunted by his own reflection, desperate for redemption before it was too late. The city was restless that night, neon lights blinking against the clouds as though they too shared the unease simmering beneath the surface of the Peter family. Within the mansion, the grand halls were silent. But in Thomas Peter's chest, a storm had begun to rage. He had spent days weighed down by guilt, by the haunting image of his son bent over crates and mocked in the streets. The vision had followed him into his dreams, gnawing at him until his iron will began to crack. That evening, he sat in the dining room with Dorothy and Carolyn. The table was set with precisely crystal glasses gleaming, silverware polished, but the food remained untouched. Dorothy's gentle attempts at conversation faltered against his brooding silence. Carolyn's eyes darted nervously between her parents, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Thomas lifted a glass of water, his hand trembling faintly. He tried to ignore it, but then a sharp pain shot across his chest, seizing his breath. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the table. "Thomas!" Dorothy gasped, rushing to his side. His face drained of color, sweat breaking across his brow. He clutched his chest, the pain radiating down his arm. The helplessness was terrifying for a man who had conquered boardrooms and bent rivals to his will. "Call an ambulance!" Carolyn cried, fumbling with her phone, her hands shaking. But Dorothy's instincts moved faster. She remembered Barbara, the nurse who had saved countless lives, the woman Thomas had scorned. Turning to her daughter, she said urgently, "No. Call Barbara. Only she can help him now." Carolyn hesitated, torn between fear and the memory of her father's anger. But the desperation in Dorothy's voice propelled her forward. She dialed quickly, her fingers trembling. "Barbara," she whispered when the line connected, her voice breaking. "It is Father. He has collapsed. Please, please come." Barbara was still in her scrubs, just home from a grueling shift, when the call reached her. Her first instinct was hesitation. The man who had condemned her, who had mocked her love, and who had cast Jensen aside, was now asking for her help from his family. But she did not hesitate long. She grabbed her bag and rushed out into the night, her heart pounding. Minutes later, Barbara and Jensen arrived at the mansion. Marcus opened the door with a look of relief and urgency, leading them swiftly inside. The grand house, once a place Barbara associated with hostility and rejection, now felt suffused with fragility. In the living room, Thomas lay sprawled on the couch, Dorothy kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears. His breaths were shallow, his lips tinged with gray. Barbara knelt at his side immediately, her training overriding her emotions. "Move back," she instructed calmly. "I need space." Dorothy and Carolyn obeyed at once, watching with wide, fearful eyes. Jensen hovered close, his fists clenched, torn between anger at his father and terror at losing him. Barbara pressed 2 fingers to Thomas's neck, checking his pulse. weak and erratic. She pulled a stethoscope from her bag, listening quickly, then unbuttoned his shirt to attach portable pads she carried for emergencies. Her movements were swift, precise, every second counted. "Thomas, can you hear me?" she said firmly. His eyelids fluttered but did not open. "His heart rhythm is unstable," Barbara announced. "We cannot wait for the ambulance." Jensen lifts his head slightly. "Carolyn, bring me a pillow to support him." They followed her instructions without question. Barbara administered oxygen from a small tank she carried, her voice steady despite the tension. When Thomas's chest seized again, she positioned her hands and began compressions, her strength fueled not only by duty but by the knowledge that this man, for all his flaws, was Jensen's father. Dorothy sobbed into her hands, whispering prayers. Carolyn clutched her mother's arm, her face pale. Jensen knelt opposite Barbara, his eyes burning with fear as he followed her lead, supporting when needed. Time stretched into eternity. Then, at last, Thomas's chest rose with a deeper breath, his color shifting slowly back toward life. Barbara rechecked his pulse, relief softening her expression. "He is stabilizing," she said, her voice calm. "We still need to get him to the hospital, but he will make it through the night." When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics rushed him onto a stretcher, but they paused to listen as Barbara gave detailed instructions, her authority unquestioned. They nodded with respect before wheeling Thomas out. As the doors closed behind them, silence fell heavy in the mansion. Dorothy stepped forward, tears glistening, and grasped Barbara's hands tightly. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved my husband." Barbara shook her head gently. "It was my duty. Any nurse would have done the same." But Dorothy knew better. She saw the compassion in Barbara's eyes, the willingness to rise above anger and pride. She embraced her, her tears wetting Barbara's shoulder. "Thank you. Thank you for proving to me what love truly looks like." Carolyn approached too, her voice unsteady. "Barbara, I am sorry for the way things have been. Tonight, you showed us all who you really are. No matter what Father says, I want to stand by you and Jensen." Jensen's chest swelled with pride as he wrapped an arm around Barbara, pulling her close. "This is who she has always been," he said fiercely. "The woman who risked everything for me, who carries more strength than any empire my father could build." Barbara looked up at him, exhaustion in her eyes, but also a quiet fire. For the first time, she felt truly seen by his family, not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged. At the hospital later that night, Thomas regained full consciousness. His gaze fell first on Dorothy, then Carolyn, and finally on Barbara and Jensen standing together at the foot of the bed. His voice was hoarse, each word a struggle. "You saved me," he murmured, looking at Barbara with something between awe and shame. Barbara's tone was soft but unwavering. "I did what anyone would have done. But perhaps it is time you see that love, not power, sustains life. Without it, all the wealth in the world means nothing." Thomas's eyes closed, tears slipping down his face. He could not yet speak the words forming in his heart, but the walls he had built so high had begun to crack. As Barbara and Jensen left the hospital that night, hand in hand beneath the glow of the streetlights, a new chapter of their struggle began. They had faced poverty, rejection, and humiliation, yet their love had endured. And now, through compassion, Barbara had planted the seed of change in the heart of the man who had been their fiercest enemy. The trials were not over, and the battles had not yet been won, but the tide had shifted. For in saving Thomas, Barbara had done more than preserve his life. She had shown him a reflection of the man he once was, and could still choose to be. And for the first time in years, hope entered the halls of the Peter family, fragile but real, waiting for the moment when pride would finally give way to love. The sterile light of the hospital room fell gently across Thomas Peter's face as he lay propped against the pillows, his body weakened but his mind restless. Machines beeped steadily at his side, each sound a reminder that his life, once defined by control and command, now hung on fragile threads of mortality. For days he had fought within himself, torn between the pride that had built his empire and the humility that had cracked open his heart. Dorothy sat quietly in a chair by the window, her hands folded around a rosary she had taken to carrying again since Thomas's collapse. She glanced at him every so often, her eyes softening with love and reproach. Carolyn perched at the foot of the bed, trying to distract him with small talk, though her father's responses were short, weighed down by unspoken thoughts. Barbara entered last, her step hesitant but steady, Jensen at her side. She wore her nurse's uniform still, the lines of exhaustion on her face softened by the quiet dignity that had never left her. Thomas's gaze lifted and lingered on her, a flicker of discomfort in his expression. He had expected resentment, perhaps even anger. Instead, he saw compassion, and it unsettled him more than hostility ever could. "Mr. Peter," Barbara said gently, her tone calm but firm. "How are you feeling today?" He shifted, grimacing slightly. "Alive, thanks to you." There was a pause. Dorothy's gaze moved between them, urging him silently to go on. Thomas swallowed, pride rising in his throat like a bitter taste he no longer wished to swallow. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words scraping against years of habit. "For the way I treated you, for the things I said. You had every right to leave me there that night, to let me pay the price of my own cruelty. But you did not. You chose to save me." Barbara's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "I did what I would have done for anyone. But perhaps what matters is not that I saved you, but that you see now what truly matters." Jensen stepped closer, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed the weight of long-buried hurt. "Father, you once told me that love was weakness, that loyalty was measured in contracts, not in hearts. But Barbara has shown us all that love is the greatest strength. Without it, wealth and power mean nothing." Thomas looked at his son, the image of the boy who had once stood beneath an oak tree, vowing never to abandon love flashing before him. He had once dismissed that vow as childish, but now he saw its truth more clearly than any financial report he had ever studied. "I was wrong," Thomas admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought I was protecting you, Jensen, by forcing you down the path I believed was right. I thought I was shielding you from the mistakes of my own youth. But, in doing so, I became the very man I once swore I would never be. I nearly destroyed you, and I nearly destroyed us all." Tears glistened in Dorothy's eyes as she rose from her chair and took his hand. "It is never too late, Thomas. What matters is that you see it now." Carolyn wiped at her cheeks, her voice trembling. "We all wanted was to stand together as a family. Please do not let pride keep us apart any longer." Silence stretched, heavy with the weight of decades. Then Thomas extended his hand toward Jensen, a gesture both tentative and desperate. Jensen hesitated, his heart warring between the memory of years of coldness and the raw vulnerability he now saw in his father's eyes. Slowly, he stepped forward and clasped the hand, feeling the tremor of age and weakness within it. "I forgive you," Jensen said quietly. "Not because it is easy, no longer because I do not want bitterness us any longer. But understand this, Father, my life with Barbara is not a rebellion. It is my truth, and if you truly want reconciliation, you must accept her as part of this family." Thomas's gaze shifted to Barbara, and for the first time, there was no disdain, no condescension, only humility. "Barbara," he said, his voice low, "I accept you, not because you saved my life, though I owe you more than I can ever repay, but because I see now that you are why my son is whole. You are his strength, and you are the heart I lost long ago when I traded love for ambition." Barbara's eyes filled with tears, and she bowed her head slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Peter. That is all I ever wanted, for Jensen to have his family not torn apart by pride, but bound together by love." Dorothy moved forward and embraced her, her tears falling freely. Carolyn followed, wrapping her arms around Barbara as well, their unity sealing what words had begun. Jensen held his fiancée close, his chest swelling with relief and gratitude. For the first time in years, the Peter family felt whole again. The walls that had divided them had begun to crumble, replaced by a fragile but genuine bond. In the days that followed, Thomas's recovery continued, each step marked by physical healing and emotional transformation. He asked Barbara to visit often, sometimes under the guise of needing medical advice, though Dorothy knew he sought her presence for something more. He listened to her stories from the hospital and her reflections on life, and slowly he began seeing the world through eyes unclouded by ambition. One evening, as the sun set outside the hospital window, Thomas called Jensen to his side. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "I want you to know that I am proud of you. Not for the deals you once made or the company you once led, but for the man you became when you chose love over power. You have succeeded in a way I never did. You found the courage to honor your heart." Jensen's throat tightened, emotion thick in his voice. "I only wish you could have seen it sooner. But hearing you say this now means more than I can put into words." Barbara watched quietly from across the room, her heart swelling. She knew the road ahead would not be free of obstacles. The world still whispered, Miratterson still schemed, Alenges still loomed. But in this moment they had won the battle that mattered most, the battle for family, for forgiveness, for love. On the night Thomas was finally discharged, the Peters gathered at the mansion again. The atmosphere was no longer charged with hostility, but with the fragile joy of reconciliation. Dorothy insisted on preparing a modest dinner, not the elaborate feasts of the past, but a simple meal that reminded them of humbler times. As they sat around the table, Jensen took Barbara's hand and raised a glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes meeting his father's. Thomas raised his glass in return, his gaze steady and sincere. "To love, the only legacy worth leaving." Tears shimmered in Dorothy's eyes as she whispered, "Amen." And so, the sound of laughter returned in that grand mansion, once filled with division. It was not the polished laughter of social gatherings, but the unguarded joy of a family rediscovering itself. For Barbara, it was proof that Len chosen with courage, love, and the power to heal even the deepest wounds. For Jensen, it was the fulfillment of a promise he had made beneath a golden oak decades ago. And for Thomas, it was redemption, a second chance to honor the truth he had once forgotten. The night stretched long with stories and memories, and though shadows still lingered at the edges of their lives, the fire at the center burned brightly. For the first time in years, the Peters were not divided by power or ambition. They were united by love. And in that unity lay the hope of a future stronger than any empire. The morning of the wedding dawned with a quiet brilliance that seemed almost scripted by fate itself. Sunlight spilled over the sprawling grounds of the Peter mansion, washing the marble facade in soft gold. Birdsong filtered through the air as though the world had paused to celebrate this moment, a union not bound by contracts or fortunes, but by a promise made decades ago beneath a golden oak. Barbara stood in one of the guest rooms overlooking the gardens, her reflection trembling in the tall mirror. The dress she wore was simple yet elegant, chosen not for extravagance but for meaning. Ivory satin fell in gentle folds, unadorned by jewels, her veil pinned with a ribbon she had kept for 20 years. The same ribbon that once fluttered on an oak branch as a symbol of a child's vow, now rested above her heart as she prepared to fulfill it. Dorothy fussed gently with the veil, her eyes glistening with both pride and emotion. "You look radiant," she whispered. "Thomas is waiting downstairs. He insisted he be the one to walk you to the aisle." Barbara's throat tightened. Only months ago, the thought of Thomas Peter walking her anywhere, let alone giving her his blessing, had seemed impossible. Yet here they were, scars still healing, but hearts reconciled. Carolyn entered the room next, her own gown a soft blue, carrying a small box in her hands. "This is for you," she said with a smile. Inside lay a delicate string of pearls, passed down through generations of Peters. "Mother wants you to have them. She says you are family now." Barbara touched the pearls reverently, humbled by the gesture. For years, she had been branded an outsider, unworthy of the Peter name. Today, she was not only welcomed but honored. Meanwhile, in another room, Jensen adjusted his tie with steady hands. His suit was tailored but modest compared to the extravagant attire he once wore at galas. He did not need embellishments. He carried with him the quiet strength of a man who had faced loss, endured humiliation, and chosen love above all else. Rebecca, his loyal assistant, hovered nearby, her usually stern expression softened with genuine warmth. "You have done many bold things in business, Mr. Peter," she remarked. "But this is by far the bravest." Jensen chuckled, his eyes fixed on the ring he held between his fingers. "This is the only decision I have ever made with absolute certainty." The gardens were filled with guests as the hour arrived. Friends from Barbara's hospital stood side by side with business associates who had once doubted Jensen, but now respected him for his defiance of convention. Even some of those who had whispered against Barbara came, drawn by the undeniable gravity of this union. The aisle stretched beneath an archway of white roses and ivy. A soft breeze carried their fragrance through the crowd as music began to play, gentle and hopeful. Thomas stood at the threshold of the mansion, his arm extended toward Barbara. His face, once hardened by pride, now carried the weight of humility. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Barbara slipped her hand into his, her heart racing. "Thank you," she whispered. Together they walked into the light. The crowd rose as one, but Barbara saw only Jensen at the end of the aisle. His eyes locked on hers, brimming with a devotion that had never wavered across 20 long years. Step by step, the distance between them closed. For Thomas, each step was a penance, a surrender of pride. For Barbara, each step was the fulfillment of a promise. When at last they reached Jensen, Thomas placed her hand into his son's and whispered, "Do not waste what I nearly destroyed. Love her with all that you are." "I already do," Jensen replied, his voice thick with emotion. The ceremony was simple, stripped of pomp and spectacle. The officiant spoke of vows, of faith and resilience. But it was the couple's own words that bound them together. Jensen's voice trembled as he began, "Barbara, I have loved you since the moment we sat beneath that oak tree. 20 years could not break it. Poverty could not smother it. Pride could not bury it. You are my compass, my anchor, and my home. I vow to honor you not with wealth or titles, but with every beat of my heart." Barbara's eyes filled with tears as she answered, "Jensen, I have walked through shadows and storms, but even in the darkest nights, the memory of you lit my way. I vow to stand beside you, not only in joy, but in struggle, not only in triumph, but in loss. You are the love I waited for, the promise I kept. With you, I am whole." When the rings slid onto their fingers, the crowd erupted into applause. Their kiss was not the polished display of socialite unions, but the raw and trembling seal of a vow long kept. As the ceremony ended, laughter and music filled the gardens. Guests mingled beneath lanterns strung through the trees, their glow casting warmth over the celebration. Dorothy and Carolyn danced together, their joy unrestrained. Marcus, the loyal driver, stood at the edge of the crowd smiling quietly at the sight of a family mended. Thomas remained seated, his strength not fully restored, but his eyes never left the couple. For the first time in decades, he felt peace. Later, Jensen and Barbara stood before the gathered guests, announcing not a honeymoon in exotic lands, nor an empire reclaimed, but a vision for their future. "We will not return to the life my father built," Jensen declared, his arm around Barbara. "Instead, we will build something new, something that reflects who we are together. We plan to create a foundation dedicated to helping families in need, offering opportunities to those who, like us, know what it means to struggle. Wealth is meaningless unless it serves others. This is the legacy we choose." Applause followed, some polite, some heartfelt, but Barbara felt a swell of pride unlike any she had ever known. They were not merely uniting their lives, they were redefining what legacy meant. As the night deepened, Barbara slipped away for a moment, wandering to the edge of the garden where an oak tree stood, planted years ago when the estate was first built. She rested her hand against its bark, remembering another oak in a small town far away. Tears slid down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Jensen found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "A new oak for a new promise," he murmured. She leaned back against him, her heart full. And this time, nothing will tear it down. Fireworks lit the sky above them, then bright bursts of color reflected in their eyes. The crowd cheered, music swelled, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause in reverence. Their wedding was not the union of empires, nor the sealing of contracts. It was the triumph of love over pride, of forgiveness over bitterness, of two souls who had defied destiny and chosen each other. And as they held one another beneath the glow of fireworks and lanterns, Barbara and Jensen knew that their journey was not ending here. It was only beginning, built not on wealth, but on love strong enough to outlast a lifetime. The weeks following the wedding unfolded with a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. For Barbara, life no longer felt like a constant battle against doubt and judgment. The mansion that once symbolized rejection now welcomed her with warmth, not as a guest, but as family. For Jensen, the weight of estrangement that had pressed on him for decades lifted. He no longer looked at his father with the bitterness of an abandoned child, but with the guarded hope of a son who had been heard at last. The Peter mansion changed with them. Where once its halls echoed with silence and power, now laughter wove through the corridors. Carolyn brought her friends from the city. Dorothy invited neighbors to share modest dinners. And even Thomas began to open his doors not only to business associates, but to people whose company had nothing to do with profit. Barbara returned to her work at the hospital, though her life was transformed. Patients who once whispered rumors about the nurse who had caught the eye of a billionaire now saw her differently. She was still the same nurse who stayed late after shifts, who listened to their stories, who brought compassion into every room. But now she carried herself with a quiet strength, as though the trials she had endured had tempered her spirit into steel. One afternoon, while Barbara was preparing supplies for a patient, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness. She steadied herself against the counter, brushing it off at first as exhaustion. But when it happened again the following morning, she decided to see Dr. Martinez, who had been a silent witness to much of her journey. After the examination, Dr. Martinez smiled, his expression warm. "Congratulations, Barbara. You are expecting." The words stunned her. Her hand instinctively moved to her abdomen, her heart swelling with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A new life, fragile and pure, was beginning within her. That evening she returned to the mansion, her hands trembling with the secret she carried. She found Jensen in the garden, studying architectural sketches for the foundation they had announced at their wedding. He looked up at her, his face lighting, as it always did when she entered a room. "Barbara," he said, "look at this plan. We can build community centers in 3 districts by the end of the year. Affordable childcare, vocational training, health clinics, everything we dreamed of." She set the papers aside gently, her voice soft but firm. "Jensen, there is something more." He frowned, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it?" She took his hands and placed them against her stomach, tears shining in her eyes. "We are going to have a child." For a moment, silence enveloped them. Then Jensen's breath caught, his eyes widening with joy and disbelief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he might never let go. "A child," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Barbara, you have given me everything I ever dreamed of. A love that endured, a family that forgave, and now." This news spread quickly through the household. Dorothy wept openly, clasping Barbara to her chest. Carolyn danced through the halls, already making plans to decorate a nursery. Even Marcus, usually reserved, smiled broadly and declared it the happiest news he had heard in years. But it was Thomas's reaction that lingered most deeply in Barbara's heart. When she told him, he grew quiet, his gaze turning distant. At last he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I once thought legacy was measured in wealth and influence, but watching you save my life, watching you bring my son back to me, and now hearing this, I realize legacy is not what we leave in ledgers, but what we leave in love." He placed a hand gently on Barbara's shoulder, his eyes damp. "Thank you for giving me a second chance to be the man I should have been all along. Thank you for carrying forward the love I nearly buried." The months that followed were filled with both anticipation and transformation. Jensen threw himself into the foundation's work with renewed vigor, determined to create a world where children, including his own, would grow up with opportunities not dictated by wealth alone. Barbara continued her work at the hospital for as long as she could, driven by the desire to serve others even as new life grew within her. Their evenings were filled with quiet moments, Barbara reading on the couch while Jensen sketched plans. Jensen resting his head against her stomach to feel the faint flutter of life within. Each moment was a testament to the fact that their love, once tested by distance and hardship, had blossomed into something eternal. As Barbara's due date approached, the entire Peter family gathered with an eagerness that transcended old wounds. Dorothy sewed baby clothes by hand, smiling as she recalled Jensen's infancy. Carolyn painted murals on the nursery walls, filling them with scenes of oak trees and ribbons fluttering in the breeze. Even Thomas visited the nursery often, standing silently at the door, his eyes softening as he traced his fingers over the cradle. The night their child was born, the world outside was hushed by a gentle snow. Barbara's labor was long, and her strength was tested, but Jensen never left her side. He whispered encouragements, held her hand, and when at last the cries of new life filled the room, tears streamed freely down his face. The baby, a daughter, was placed into Barbara's arms. Tiny, perfect, her eyes wide and curious. Barbara wept softly, Jensen leaning close, his hand covering both of theirs. Her name, Barbara whispered, should honor where it all began. Let us call her Oakley. Jensen's eyes glistened as he kissed Barbara's forehead. Oakley, a reminder of the promise that carried us here. When Thomas held his granddaughter for the first time, his hands trembled. He looked into the child's eyes and saw not just innocence but redemption. Oakley, he murmured, may you grow with the strength of the tree that bore your name, and may you never forget that love is the root of all legacy. In the weeks that followed, the mansion once again became a place of gathering. Neighbors visited to welcome the child, and employees from the foundation stopped by to share their joy. Laughter once more filled the halls. Barbara would often sit by the window, Oakley cradled in her arms, watching Jensen walk the grounds with plans in his hands. She marveled at how far they had come, from 2 children making vows beneath an oak tree, to 2 adults weathering storms of pride and poverty, to parents building a future that honored both love and purpose. Their story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to Oakley, to the community they served, and to the generations who had learned that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in compassion. On a quiet evening, Jensen joined Barbara by the window. Oakley slept peacefully in her arms, her tiny breaths steady. Jensen slipped an arm around Barbara and kissed her hair. We have built something greater than I ever imagined, he whispered. Not an empire of stone, but a legacy of love. Barbara leaned against him, her heart full, and it will endure long after we are gone. Outside, the oak tree in the garden stood tall, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Beneath its roots lay a promise once carved in dirt by 2 children. Above its branches now stretched a future bright with hope. For Barbara and Jensen, the journey was far from over. But as they looked at their daughter, as they felt the warmth of family restored, they knew their love had already achieved something timeless. It had become eternal.